I stared at my laptop screen, my hands frozen over the keyboard. My heart pounded in my chest as I refreshed the page, hoping, praying, that it was some kind of glitch. But the number didn't change. My trust fund, the one my father had left for me before he passed away, was gone. Every last cent, a lifetime of security, years of careful planning, wiped out. And the worst part? I already knew who had taken it. Rick, my stepfather. The man who had married my mother when I was 13. The man who had always treated me like I was some kind of burden. He never raised a hand against me, but his words cut deeper than any slap ever could. You should be grateful I even put a roof over your head. You think money just appears out of thin air? He had always resented the fact that my father had left me something of my own, and now it was gone. I confronted my mother first. She looked guilty, shifting in her seat, avoiding my eyes. "Nova, it's complicated," she said. "Rick only borrowed some of it." My stomach twisted. "Some of it?" I spat. "There's nothing left." My voice trembled, but I refused to cry. I could see the truth written all over her face. She had known. Maybe not from the start, but she had known long enough. And she had done nothing. Rick walked into the room, acting like he had done nothing wrong. "You're overreacting," he said with a scoff. "That money was just sitting there. It was for the family." He said it like I was selfish for being angry, like it was my fault for expecting to have what was rightfully mine. My hands clenched into fists. That was my father's money, not yours, not the family's, mine. But he just smirked. "And what were you going to do with it? Waste it on college? On some useless degree?" His words were like poison, but I refused to let them sink in. I stormed out that night. I left with nothing but the clothes on my back and $100 in my bank account. Rick had taken everything else. My mother didn't stop me. She didn't even try. I spent the next 5 years rebuilding. It wasn't easy. I worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs at a time, balancing school, rent, and survival. I learned to live on instant noodles, to stretch every dollar, to push through exhaustion even when my body begged me to stop. But I never gave up. I refused to let Rick win. Slowly, I started building something of my own. At 25, I was no longer the scared, betrayed girl who had walked out of that house. I had my own business, one that I had built from the ground up. It wasn't massive, but it was mine. I had enough money to live comfortably, to travel, to invest in my future. Everything Rick had stolen from me, I had rebuilt with my own 2 hands. And then, one day, my phone rang. It was my mother. I almost didn't pick up. But some small part of me, the part that still wanted to believe she cared, answered. Her voice was hesitant, unsure. "Nova, Rick needs help." I almost laughed. The audacity. After everything he had done, after taking my trust fund, after leaving me with nothing, now he needed my help? I leaned back in my chair, the irony settling over me like a heavy blanket. "Is that so?" she sighed. "His business failed. We lost the house. He hasn't been able to find work. We're drowning in debt." She didn't have to say it. I knew what was coming. "Nova, you're doing well, right?" There it was. The real reason for the call. She wasn't checking in on me. She wasn't asking how I had survived. She was asking me to save him. I let the silence stretch long enough for her to feel the weight of it. Then, in the calmest voice I could manage, I asked, "What happened to the money, Mom?" She hesitated. It was supposed to be temporary. Rick had big plans, investments. He was going to turn it into something more. I closed my eyes. Of course. He had gambled with my future like it was pocket change, like it didn't matter, and now, after he had lost everything, he had the nerve to come to me? I didn't yell, I didn't curse, I just said, "No," she stammered. "Nova, please, we have nowhere else to turn." "You had a choice," I interrupted. "You chose him, you let him steal from me, and now you want me to fix it?" She started crying, but I didn't feel sorry for her, not anymore. I had spent too many nights crying myself to sleep, wondering how I would survive, wondering why she had let him do this to me. Rick called me a few days later. His voice was tired, desperate. The arrogance he had always carried was gone. "Nova, listen. I know we had our differences, but I raised you. I took care of you. Don't you think you owe me something?" I actually laughed. A full, genuine laugh. "You didn't raise me, Rick. You stole from me, and now you want me to pay you back for it?" There was silence on the other end, then a bitter sigh. "I should have taken more," he muttered. "You turned out ungrateful anyway." That was all I needed to hear. I blocked his number. The last I heard, he had moved into a tiny apartment above some gas station. He was still in debt, still bitter, still blaming everyone else for his downfall. My mother stayed with him. That was her choice, just like it had been her choice to stand by while he took everything from me. Me? I thrived. My business grew beyond what I ever imagined. I had everything I had once lost, and more. And every now and then, I would log into my new account, the one I had built from scratch, and smile at the balance. Because this time, it was mine. No one could take it from me, and I had done it all without them. A year passed, and I barely thought about Rick or my mother. My life had moved on, and I was focused on expanding my business. I had new clients, new opportunities, and a future that was completely mine. But then, one evening, as I was closing up my office, an unknown number flashed across my phone screen. I hesitated before answering. It was Amanda, Rick's sister. We had never been particularly close, so for her to call me out of the blue meant something had happened. Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "Nova, I don't know if you care, but Rick's in trouble." I leaned against my desk. "What kind of trouble?" She sighed. "Bad financial decisions. He took out loans to cover his debts, but he can't pay them back. Some of the people he owes money to, they're not exactly the type you want to be in debt with." I frowned. This wasn't surprising. Rick had always lived like money would magically appear when he needed it. And when it didn't, he just took more from whoever was dumb enough to give it to him. This time, it seemed like he had run out of options. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Amanda hesitated before finally saying, "Because he's still convinced you'll help him." I laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. "He's delusional." "Yeah," she agreed, "but that's never stopped him before." The next day, I got an email. It was from Rick. I almost deleted it without reading, but curiosity got the better of me. The message was long, filled with excuses, but one sentence stood out. "I made mistakes, Nova, but I was still your father figure. You owe me that much." Owe him? The man who stole my trust fund? Who left me struggling while he lived comfortably? I clenched my jaw, reading the words over again. He had never changed. He still saw me as someone he could manipulate. That night, I got another call. This time it was my mother. I almost didn't answer, but something inside me told me to hear her out. "Nova, please," she started, her voice breaking. "Rick is desperate. He's going to lose everything." "He already lost everything," I replied coldly. "He's going to lose his life," she whispered. "You don't understand the kind of people he's involved with. They've been showing up at the house, demanding money. We don't have anything left." For the first time, I heard real fear in her voice, and for a brief moment, I felt something I hadn't in years. Pity. Not for Rick, but for my mother. She had chosen him over me, over my future, and now she was finally paying the price. "I'm sorry, Mom," I said quietly, "but this isn't my problem." She let out a choked sob. "You're really going to let him suffer?" I took a deep breath. "You let me suffer." She had no response to that. I hung up. 2 weeks later, I found out Rick had been arrested for fraud. He had been running some shady investment scheme, promising big returns to people desperate enough to believe him. When he couldn't pay them back, the authorities got involved. He was facing serious charges. I wasn't surprised. But what did surprise me was the last message I ever got from my mother. "I don't expect you to forgive us. I just want you to know. I finally understand. I should have protected you. I should have listened. I lost you because of him, and now I have nothing left. I'm so sorry." I stared at the message for a long time, and for the first time in years, I let myself feel the sadness that had been buried beneath my anger. She had finally realized the truth, but it was too late. I never replied. I moved forward with my life, just like I always had. And when people asked me how I became successful despite everything, I always gave them the same answer. Because I learned early on, no one is coming to save you. You have to save yourself. Months passed, and life continued as if Rick had never existed. My business thrived, expanding into new markets, and I had finally started enjoying the fruits of my hard work. I traveled, met incredible people, and built a life where no one had control over me. I had spent so many years fighting to survive that now, for the first time, I was truly living. Then, one evening, as I was going through emails, a headline caught my eye. Former businessman Richard Hale sentenced to 5 years for fraud. I blinked at the screen. 5 years. It wasn't a lifetime, but it was enough. Enough for him to sit with the weight of his choices. Enough for him to realize that the world wasn't going to bend for him anymore. I clicked the article, my stomach tightening as I read. The case had been straightforward. He had taken money from desperate investors, promising them returns he couldn't deliver. When they pressed for answers, he had stalled, lied, and tried to dig himself out of a hole that only got deeper. Eventually, someone had tipped off the authorities. And just like that, his empire of deception collapsed. The final paragraph mentioned his family. Hale's wife declined to comment on her husband's sentencing. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. My mother had stayed. She had chosen him again, even after everything. A part of me had expected her to leave, to finally cut ties with the man who had ruined both our lives. But she hadn't. And that was all I needed to know. A week later, a letter arrived in my mailbox. There was no return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. My stomach twisted as I opened it. Nova, I know you hate me. I know you think I deserve this. Maybe I do. But 5 years is a long time, and I don't have anyone else. Your mother has stopped visiting, and I don't know if I'll ever see the outside of this place again. I've lost everything. I don't even have enough money to buy decent food in here. But you have everything now, more than you could ever need. Would it really hurt you to help me, just a little? I stared at the letter, my hands gripping the paper so tightly it crumpled. He still didn't get it. He still thought he was owed something. Even in prison, even with nothing left, he still believed he had the right to ask me for more. I pulled out a pen and grabbed a sheet of paper. I wasn't going to let this fester. I wasn't going to let him think for a second that I was considering it. Rick, you took everything from me. You stole my trust fund, my security, my future. You left me with nothing, and you expected me to fail. But I didn't fail. I built myself up without you, without your help, without your money. And now, you want something from me? You want me to make your life easier after you ruined mine? Here's my answer. Number, I owe you nothing, and I never will. Enjoy prison. Nova. I folded the letter, sealed the envelope, and tossed it in the mail. And with that, I closed the chapter on Rick forever. I never heard from Rick again after that letter. Whether he got it, read it, or ripped it apart in frustration, I didn't care. His words, his existence, no longer had power over me. I had spent years letting my anger fuel me, letting the betrayal sit in the back of my mind as a reminder of why I had to succeed. But now, I realized something. I didn't need the anger anymore. Success was no longer about proving anything to him. It was about me, my life, my dreams, my future. And I wasn't going to let the past define me any longer. Months passed, then a year. I expanded my business into a second location, hired new employees, bought a house, a place that was mine, built with my own money, my own effort. The kind of security I was supposed to have from my trust fund, I had built for myself. And the best part? No one could take it from me. Every now and then, people from my past would reach out. An old family friend who had heard about my success, a a former classmate who had seen my name in an article. Even my mother, though she never asked for anything, just sent short messages, updates about her life. I never responded, not because I was still angry, but because I had nothing left to say. Then, one afternoon, I was sitting in my office, reviewing a new business proposal when my assistant knocked on the door. "Nova, there's someone here to see you." I frowned. "Do they have an appointment?" "No, but—" "She says she's your mother." I hadn't seen her in nearly 2 years. The last time we had spoken was the night she begged me to help Rick. I wasn't sure how I'd feel seeing her again, but I forced myself to stay composed. I nodded. "Send her in." When she walked through the door, I barely recognized her. She looked smaller, worn down. There was a sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. "You look good," she finally said. I leaned back in my chair. "What do you want?" She flinched at my directness, but didn't look away. "I'm not here to ask for anything. I wanted to see you." I didn't respond. She sighed, sitting down across from me. "I left him." I raised an eyebrow. "After all this time?" She nodded. I waited. I thought maybe when he got out things would be different. But the first thing he did when he got released was try to find someone else to take care of him. He hasn't changed. He never will. I studied her for a moment, trying to find the woman I had once trusted, the mother who had let me down so many times. She looked tired, but there was something else there too, something that almost resembled regret. "I know I failed you," she admitted quietly. "I know that. And I don't expect you to forgive me. I wanted you to know that I finally understand." I let out a slow breath. Part of me wanted to tell her it was too late, that she had made her choice, that I had spent years learning how to live without her. But another part of me, a much smaller part, realized that this was her version of an apology. "What do you want from me?" I asked again. "Nothing." Her voice was steady. "I just wanted to see you one last time, to say that I'm proud of you, that I was wrong, and that I'm sorry." For the first time in years, I felt the tightness in my chest loosen. I wasn't sure if I could forgive her. I wasn't sure if I even wanted to, but I realized something at that moment. I didn't hate her anymore. I didn't need to. She stood up, hesitating for just a second before heading toward the door. But before she could leave, I spoke. "Are you okay?" She turned back, surprised. Then she nodded. "I will be." I didn't stop her as she walked out of my life. And this time I didn't feel abandoned. I felt free. Years passed, and life continued to move forward. My business had grown beyond what I ever imagined, with multiple locations and an expanding online presence. I traveled, I invested, and I surrounded myself with people who valued and respected me. The betrayal that once defined my past had become nothing more than a distant memory, something I had overcome, not something that controlled me. Every now and then, I'd hear whispers about Rick. He had burned every bridge, used up every last favor, and from what I gathered, he was still struggling to stay afloat. No job lasted long. No business venture ever succeeded. The world had stopped bending to his excuses, and he had no one left to manipulate. Then, one evening, I received a letter. It had no return address, but I knew exactly who it was from the moment I saw the shaky handwriting. "Nova, I know I don't deserve your time, but this is probably the last time you'll ever hear from me. My health isn't great, and life hasn't been kind. I won't make excuses. I just wanted to say that maybe, deep down, I always knew you'd be the one to make it, not me. You were always stronger than I wanted to believe. You didn't need me. You never did. I don't expect anything from you. I just hope that, in whatever way you can, you'll remember me as more than my mistakes. Maybe that's selfish of me. Maybe I don't deserve it. But I needed to say it. Rick." I read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and set it aside. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel anger. I just felt done. Rick had never been my father. He had been an obstacle, a lesson I had been forced to learn the hard way. And now, even he seemed to realize it. I never wrote back. 1 year later, I heard from an old family acquaintance that Rick had passed away. There was no dramatic ending, no grand moment of regret. Just a simple truth. He was gone. He had left behind nothing. No fortune, no legacy, no real impact on the world. Just debts, broken relationships, and a lifetime of selfish choices. I sat with the news for a moment, then turned back to my desk. I had orders to fulfill, clients to meet, a life to keep building. His story had ended, but mine was still being written, and this time I was the only one holding the pen. Years later, as I stood in my office overlooking the city, I reflected on everything that had brought me here. The betrayals, the struggles, the nights I had spent wondering if I would ever make it. The pain had once felt like a weight I would carry forever, but now it felt like something else. Fuel. It had shaped me, but it no longer defined me. Rick was gone. My mother had disappeared into a quiet life somewhere far from me. The people who had once controlled my fate were no longer part of my world. And yet, I had never felt more whole, more free. I had built a life on my own terms. The little girl who had once been powerless, who had once watched everything be taken from her, had grown into a woman who owned everything she had. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need validation. Success had been my answer to everything. On my desk, tucked into the corner, was a framed piece of paper. It wasn't Rick's letter or an old bank statement showing the money he had stolen. It was a note I had written to myself years ago when I was still struggling, still fighting to believe in my future. No one is coming to save you, so save yourself. I ran my fingers over the words, smiling. That version of me, the one who had written it, had no idea how strong she would become. But I did. I turned off the lights in my office, stepping into the world I had built, a world that belonged to me, a future that no one could take away. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was running from my past. I was walking towards something greater,